We began the last episode with the Winesburg Massacre, which was the shocking spectacle of a nobleman and several knights being massacred by peasants who'd taken control of a castle in a German town on Easter Monday, 1525. And this episode is important because it is a turning point in a much larger movement that historians have come to call the Peasants' War. Now, this is the second in 2 episodes on the Peasants' War. But to recap briefly, in our last episode, we covered the beginning of the uprising. Up to this point, the Peasants' War has really just been an organized labor strike. It began in the autumn of 1524 with disgruntled peasants refusing to supply labor on demand for their feudal, noble overlords. And this sense of discontent and anger spread very rapidly across the landscape. And in a few months' time, we have not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of peasants who have organized amongst themselves and have agreed to withhold labor, to withhold the payment of rents, either in cash form or in labor form, to their landlords. And these landlords include not just nobles, but also princes of the church, bishops, abbots, monasteries, which hold land and rely on the labor of peasants or serfs to extract revenue from it. So while it's been dramatic, and while what is now Germany, but was then part of the Holy Roman Empire, had never seen a labor strike on this scale, that's mostly what's been going on. The peasants have formulated a manifesto, and they've called it the 12 Articles. And what's significant about this document is that it's not just an economic document. It's a document that expresses grievances that peasants across Germany share. From many districts, even though they are separated from hundreds of miles, they're united by a shared set of economic pressures. And these aren't new. For more detail on this, listen to the last episode. But the other thing about the document that is so fascinating is that these economic grievances, which were significant and ongoing, are expressed in the language of the Reformation. Martin Luther had modeled this, the idea that a single person could hold up the text of the Bible and say, this is the word of God, this is the measure of Christianity, and everyone should be accountable to this. These were the words of a German monk, which were first uttered in 1517, and Martin Luther's name has since become synonymous with the Protestant Reformation. But we normally remember him as a theologian, as a reformer. For the peasants, he was the inspiration for a radical revision, not just of how Christian worship was undertaken, but for the entire organization of a Christian society. They had taken his words and put them at the heart of their demands for a large-scale renegotiation of the entire social contract. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and as I've already indicated, this is the second of 2 episodes on the Peasants' War. It's also closely connected to a larger 5-part series that I've released on the Protestant Reformation, which is, of course, the moment that the Western Christian world splits into Catholic and Protestant. And so for more information on some of the major figures there, including Martin Luther, John Wycliffe, and John Calvin, and the wars of religion that followed it, I highly recommend that you check out those individual episodes as well. Also, for more information on this podcast, including sources that I've used to put it together, or if you're just interested in supporting the podcast, please check out the link to my Patreon, which is in the episode descriptions. For today, we're going to pick up our story with the Winesburg Massacre. And the reason why this is such a significant moment is that it's really a turning point where the Peasants' War goes from being an organized labor strike to something more violent. And in particular, the spectacle of armed peasants storming a castle and executing Count Ludwig, their overlord, was something that struck fear into the hearts of nobles across what is now Germany, because they said to themselves, my God, if the peasants are going to rise up and do this to that count, they could be at the gates of my estate next. And so the real sense of personal threat and of violence being visited upon noblemen themselves is what materializes at this moment. But what's significant about this also is that violence isn't new. Violence has been the standard tool that nobles have used to keep peasants in line for generations. And we're going to see that happening as the preamble to this particular episode, this Winesburg Massacre. What's shocking about the Winesburg Massacre is that for the first time, violence is being visited in the other direction, from the peasants upon the nobles, instead of the other way around. And this moment, Easter Monday, April 1525, has been preceded by a large amount of the usual sort of violence, the violence of the nobles. So what happened was that Count Ludwig, who occupied the castle at Winesburg, had heard that there were armies of mobilized peasants moving across the landscape and putting pressure on other cities and nobles and landlords to sign covenants. And a covenant is a very religious word that the peasants are using for the most solemn agreement. And basically, these were agreements that were going to renegotiate the obligations of landlords toward peasants and vice versa. So these mobilized gangs of armed peasants are showing up outside other towns and other castles, and they're making a demand that the landlord sign one of these covenant agreements with them. So Count Ludwig of Winesburg Castle is very worried about this. And he decides to ride to the local capital of government, the city of Stuttgart, to ask for reinforcements. He doesn't have a lot of armed men in the castle with him at this time, so he needs to get some backup. And he receives some, a handful of knights, not many, but more than he had before. And with these mercenaries, he turns around and rides back from Stuttgart toward Winesburg. On the way, though, they decide to stop and kill any peasants on Count Ludwig's estate that he suspects of rebel sympathies. Now, one wonders what his suspicion was based on, or what grounds he had to be certain. Did he just cut them down with swords in the fields as they rode by? Or did he and his knights ride into some local villages where he suspected there were troublemakers or sympathizers and just start stabbing people to death in their houses? It's not clear how he made the decision, but we do know that he made a point of killing these peasants, some of them that were on his road home, that were serfs on his land. Having left a trail of bloody corpses in his wake, Count Ludwig and his handful of mercenaries returned to the castle at Winesburg. Some days later, he's very dismayed to learn that an armed band of peasants has arrived outside the town of Winesburg. And sure enough, they're putting pressure on the town to support the rebellion and to sign a covenant with them as rebels. And Count Ludwig does everything he can to try and prevent this from happening and to try and stall for time. There's one report that says that the Count even seized the keys to the town of Winesburg himself to prevent access. There are some reports that indicate that he sent someone to talk to the peasant negotiators and sort of engage them in conversation and waste some time, meanwhile sending some armed men to attack the peasant rearguard and inflict some damage there. So he wasn't negotiating in good faith, let's put it that way. He was doing everything he could to thwart and slow down any successful agreement with the rebels. He also threatened that any peasants on his land who supported or joined the rebels would have their homes burned. So he was applying all the pressure he could internally as well to prevent any possible success. And then he had the peasant negotiators shot at. Following these measures, the peasant army that had massed around the town and castle of Winesburg then began to engage in aggressive military action. This particular band of rebels was led by a man called Little Jack Rohrbach, and he had already had some experience as a soldier in previous battles not to do with the peasant rebellion, so he had some idea what he was doing in terms of leading men around to attack things. And he decides that since the negotiators have been shot at, the time for talking is over and the time for fighting is here. So Little Jack's peasants successfully seize the castle and they surround the town. They manage to enter the town, and it turns out that Count Ludwig and some of his knights are holed up inside the church bell tower. Once they realize that they're stuck in there and they've been surrounded by rebels outside, there's no escape, they surrender. So they're allowed to come down out of the bell tower, and it's at this point that they're marched off back to the castle, which is now thoroughly occupied by rebellious peasants. At this point, Count Ludwig's wife, Margaret, who's the illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, by the way, offers the peasants a lot of money to spare her husband's life, the sum of some 30,000 guilders, which is an enormous amount of money. But the peasants are having none of it, so they pack her and her tiny son off to a neighboring town, and they give them the ignominious transport of a manure cart to take this noble lady to a safe destination. Count Ludwig himself also offers money. He offers them a barrel of gold in exchange for his life. But the peasants once again refuse, and they sentence the count and his knights, the same knights who've been involved in butchering peasants and shooting at negotiators, they sentence them to death. So on Easter Monday, Count Ludwig, 10 of his mercenary knights, and 13 of their servants are led out and executed by being forced to run the gauntlet. And as I indicated in the last episode, a gauntlet is 2 lines of men facing each other, all of them holding spears, and the condemned man is forced to walk in between these lines of spearmen, and he's speared continuously until he falls down dead. So this was the manner of execution that was suffered by the count, 10 of his knights, and 13 of their servants on that day. This event, immediately dubbed the Winesburg Massacre, was controversial even amongst the peasants. You see, up to this point, many of the peasants involved in the rebellion and the drafting of these 12 articles were hoping for a mediated agreement that would settle their demands. They were hoping that the Swabian League, which was an alliance composed of nobles, knights, and imperial cities, would intervene on their behalf and require concessions from some of the more abusive nobles, so that some of their demands as rebels could be met and their economic burdens eased somewhat. These peasants recognized that the execution of a nobleman in this fashion made that kind of mediation virtually impossible. And so many of the rebels, even at that moment, realized that in some ways they had shot themselves in the foot, so to speak, and that hope of any kind of mediation had vanished. For the nobles as well, this event galvanizes the need for a very violent response. Each of them sees themselves in the body of the dead Count Ludwig and is now highly motivated to do whatever is necessary to suppress these rebels by any means, no matter how violent, to ensure the safety of themselves and their families. So even though the number of dead in this massacre numbers less than 30 people, and is going to pale in comparison to the level of butchery we're about to see explode in the Peasants' War, it's very significant because it changes the nature of the engagement in a very permanent way. In some ways, it almost seals the fate for many of the rebels in the battles that are going to follow. Little Jack Rohrbach himself, the man who'd been in charge of the peasants who massacred Count Ludwig and company, loses support basically immediately. He's no longer put in any kind of position of leadership amongst the peasants in his district who he had been leading up to this point. And so that is a measure of how much of rebel support was lost immediately as a result of this decision he had made. Prior to this moment, in addition to withholding labor, there's been a certain amount of plundering and looting that's been going on as you've had these bands of armed peasants moving across the landscape. But this looting has primarily gone on in monasteries, so properties of the church. And so plundering and looting monasteries I mean, it's frowned upon, but it hasn't been the capital crime to many German nobles that you might think, particularly because some of them are sympathetic to the Reformation. Some of them are eyeing those monasteries and thinking about the fact that if they identify themselves as Protestant, then they can perhaps seize this church land for themselves. So there are nobles who have been sympathetic to Martin Luther, who've been sheltering reformers, and who might have sort of shrugged and winked a little bit at the spectacle of peasants plundering monasteries. It couldn't have been something that they officially sanctioned, but they might not have responded with the level of violence that we're about to see. But once we have a dead aristocrat, that's going to change absolutely everything. Now, the use of force to crush this revolt up to this moment has also been limited by the fact that a large number of the fighting men are deployed elsewhere in Europe, particularly in Italy and other places. So the mercenary forces that are often employed by nobles to fight their battles between themselves and others are busy elsewhere. A lot of the fighting men that they're required to provide to the Swabian League or to the Holy Roman Emperor have been provided, and they're busy in other conflicts, which leaves the landscape very much wide open and vulnerable to armed bands of peasants, even if they are only farmers. So April is this turning point month. We see the massacre of Winesburg, and we also see full-scale military engagements beginning to happen for the first time between armed peasants and real soldiers. And the first engagement of this kind happens on April the 4th, 1525. It's called the Battle of Leppheim. In this battle, some 5,000 peasants faced off against a trained force of 8,000. 8,000 soldiers fielded by the nobles, including 1,500 cavalry. So 5,000 farmers against 8,000 trained fighters, 1,500 of those guys in heavy armor on horses. Now, if you know anything about battles, you know that the reason that having cavalry is so important at this point is that armored men on horses can mow down infantry. And so for the peasants in this battle, to be 5,000 poorly organized, not disciplined, inexperienced men facing 8,000, including cavalry, well, the results are about what you would expect. This was a real massacre, and it was a massacre of peasant farmers. The peasants were defeated with casualties in the thousands, whereas the forces fielded by the nobles suffered only a handful of casualties. It's also significant to note that the noble army here, which is fighting at the Battle of Leppheim, has been mobilized by the Swabian League. So remember, the Swabian League is the organization to whom the peasants were addressing their 12 articles. It is the alliance from whom the peasants hoped for mediation of their cause against some of these abusive landlords. The fact that the Swabian League has now fielded an army of 8,000 is a very decisive indication of the fact that there will be no mediation. At this point, it's going to be strictly a violent response. Now, I want to pause the discussion of the bloody battles, of which there will be many more here in just a moment, to talk a bit about Martin Luther. We've mentioned him a lot in the previous episode as direct inspiration for the peasant demands, as expressed in their 12 articles. And they even went further and said that they wanted Martin Luther to be one of a group of reformers in charge of determining what right laws, what the divine law ought to look like. So the peasants are very explicitly referencing Martin Luther's ideas and even him personally as an inspiration for their movement. They see their rebellion as a direct outcome of his ideas. But what specific ideas were those? Well, Martin Luther has become well known for his insistence that Christians don't need the institutional authority of the Pope or the hierarchy of the Church with its cardinals and bishops and tradition to understand the will of God. That the individual person can have a direct relationship with the divine, and that it's sort of the individual, their Bible, and God. And you may be familiar with this now because it's a distinctly Protestant idea of Christianity, and it's the inheritance of Martin Luther and others, but perhaps his name more than any other gets repeated as being associated with this conception of what Christianity looks like. So it's a very anti-hierarchical view, and Martin Luther calls it the priesthood of all believers. He says, spiritually, everyone is equal. And the peasants look at that and they say, great, we're all equal. Every one of us is equal in the sight of God, that God has died for all of us the same, the prince and the beggar, the peasant and the bishop. All of us are equally precious in God's sight. All of us were worthy of being redeemed by the blood of God's Son, Jesus. Okay, so then why is it that some of us live like dogs and slaves, while others feast? Why is it that some of us have starving children, while others live like kings? If we're all equal in the sight of God, isn't there something very wrong with how our society is currently organized? This is what the peasants are saying, and it's a very natural extension in their minds of what Martin Luther has already said. They're just applying the same principles to how society is organized, as opposed to just how the church is organized. And the peasants are asking, if no one has greater moral value or standing based on their office or their social rank, then by what right do nobles treat peasants as property? Why should they be permitted to abuse peasants with impunity? Where is the justification for that, the peasants want to know. And this might be the established order of a feudal society, which indeed it was. But the peasants are arguing that the established order of a feudal society is in direct conflict with the will of God, with the principles that are expressed in the Bible. And therefore, society needs to change. That's essentially what they're saying. And that's what makes it so radical. And this idea that common people just holding up the Bible alone could challenge everything about their society comes directly from Martin Luther. You could argue that without Martin Luther, this war would never have happened, because the economic pressures that the peasants are facing are not new. What is new is the idea that the common person, equipped with the Bible, can speak against their social betters. And that is exactly what the peasants are doing here. The reason that Luther's ideas and the peasant application of them is so shocking is that it goes directly against the established order of their society at this time, in the 1500s, which is an incredibly hierarchical society. It's a society that's governed by sort of the twin pillars. There's the state and there's the church. Both of them have a man at the apex. So in the case of the state, it's the king or the Holy Roman Emperor. Under him, there are nobles. Under them, there are burghers and wealthier artisans, and underneath them, there are peasants. So it's very much a pyramid, and the peasants are at the bottom, and they are ruled over by those who have higher rank and status than they do. And similarly with the church, you have the Pope at the top, and then there are cardinals and archbishops and bishops, and going all the way down to priests and monks and friars. And each of them has a status or a rank within that organization, a rank which makes them superior to anyone underneath them in that structure. So both of these systems, both church and state, are very hierarchical, and they require deference. They require that you know your place. And both of these pillars overlap. They both have courts. They both have taxation or revenue systems. They both have ranks. And the peasants are very much at the bottom of both of these things. So Martin Luther is attacking the Catholic idea of authority based on rank, that the Pope is uniquely equipped to interpret the tradition of Christianity for its followers because he's the Pope, and he's therefore God's special servant who has an insight and perhaps even an infallibility in these matters that other people lack. So if the Pope says something, it carries more weight than if somebody else says that the Bible says X or Y. If the Pope says it, that counts for a lot more because of who he is. And so Martin Luther's revolution is to say that these ranks of authority in terms of who knows better essentially don't exist. And the peasants are saying, that's great. If that's true over there, then why does it exist in the other pillar either? Why is it that we have to be eternally deferential and trodden under by those who have a higher rank than us? Because if we are all one under God, and if we are all equal, then where do we get off building these pillars in either category? So this is a moment that's not just a bunch of angry farmers coming together with economic grievances. It has a far greater significance because it is a challenge to the entire way that people understand themselves and their place in the world, both spiritually and in terms of their social and political obligations as well. However, although the peasants regarded Martin Luther as their inspiration, he wanted nothing to do with the peasant rebellion. He pens a response in April 19th of 1525 called An Admonition to Peace. Here, he asserts that the nobles had in some ways brought the rebellion upon themselves by making unjust demands. He says, quote, "As temporal rulers, you do nothing but cheat and rob the people so that you may lead lives of luxury and extravagance." However, he then turns on the peasants, and although he admits that the nobles have treated them unjustly, and that their 12 articles are reasonable, he asserts that the use of force cannot be justified. Quote, "The fact that rulers are wicked and unjust does not excuse disorder or rebellion." While Luther admits that the lords have unjustly taken land from peasants, he then says that the peasants are stealing authority from the lords, which is a greater crime. In other words, defending the established order in which nobles can exploit peasants is more important than the demand for fair treatment. Luther calls both sides unchristian, and he calls for a mediation and a peaceful negotiation to end the conflict. But Luther goes much further only a few weeks later, because in May 1525, at this point, there's been a number of battles, and we're going to get into the details of those. But this is post-Winesburg Massacre, post-Battle of Leipheim, post a number of other acts of violence and killing that are going to unfold. And Martin Luther is traveling parts of the countryside in the company of Philip Melanchthon, who was a close collaborator of his in Reformed theology. And he's going on a preaching tour. He's been invited on a preaching tour, actually. I believe it was a nobleman who suggested that he travel to some parts of the countryside and preach to peasants, although Luther carefully avoids some of the hotter districts where there have been more violent outbreaks. But he's receiving word of what's been going on, of the battles and of the killings and the plunderings. And so he comes out with a much angrier response to the peasant rebellion only in May, so weeks after his first one. He calls it Against the Rioting Peasants, which publishers then sensationalized. They changed the title to Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants. So that was the title that it ran under. And in this document, Luther encourages the nobles to stab, smite, and slay their rebellious peasants. He also claims that any nobleman who dies in such an undertaking would be a true martyr in the eyes of God. Meanwhile, he condemned the peasants and their sympathizers in no uncertain terms. Quote, "Anyone who consorts with them goes to the devil with them and is guilty of all the evil deeds they commit." He says, "Let everyone who can smite, slay, and stab, secretly or openly. There is nothing more poisonous, hurtful, or devilish than a rebel. One must kill them as one would kill mad dogs." Luther, in this document, which is quite a lengthy response, it's more than a couple of pages, he directly addresses the peasant claims that because we're all equal in the eyes of God, we ought to have a little more equality in the way we organize society. And he says, not so. Baptism does not make men free in body and property, but only in soul. So you can have spiritual equality, but get out of here with these claims that you should be allowed to have any kind of economic improvement. He also says that it is the duty of nobles to crush the rebels. Quote, "For the nobles, he is God's minister and the servant of his wrath, and the sword has been given to him to use against such people." So this is a strident and unambiguous defense of the use of violence by nobles against the peasants. And this is because Luther recognizes that the peasants are challenging the entire social order. And Luther is only comfortable with challenging the religious order. So he's vehemently opposed to the idea that these principles should be extended as a challenge to the social order and to obedience to the state authority, which at this time means your noble landlord. The modern state as such doesn't exist. It is a feudal state. So you owe obedience and allegiance to the nobleman whose subject you are. That's what it means to be subject to the state authorities. And Luther sees the nobles as required by God to defend order, an order in which they are at the peak of the hierarchy and the peasants need to be kept firmly underfoot. According to Luther, the peasants were guilty of 3 serious crimes. The first was oath breaking. They had broken the ritual oaths of allegiance and obedience that they were required to make to their noble lords. So they were in a state of disobedience. They had broken their oath. Number 2, theft. They had plundered monasteries. They had taken property which was not theirs. This is a crime. And the third one that he lays at their door is blasphemy. And this is where Luther says, you have shamefully used the language of religion and the gospel and the reform ideas that I've put my name behind, essentially. He doesn't say it in those words, but that's what he means. To justify things that I cannot tolerate, to justify violence against state authorities. And remember that Luther and the reformers, Philip Melanchthon and others, are heavily reliant on the protection of sympathetic nobles in Germany. This is the reason why Martin Luther didn't meet his end burning alive at the stake in Rome, which is what the Pope would have liked to have happen. When Martin Luther was excommunicated, agents of the Pope were spreading out, looking to be able to capture him and take him back to Rome for trial and execution as a heretic. The reason why Martin Luther didn't end up there is that he was sheltered by the Elector of Saxony, a German noble who deliberately used his power to protect Luther and to give him shelter and keep him alive. So you can understand why, to some degree, Luther regards the nobles as critical to the success of the Reformation. He needs their support, he needs their protection, and so to side with the rebels against the nobles would be to risk the entire Reformation being seen as one and the same, basically an anarchist movement that had to be exterminated. And so rather than see that, Martin Luther throws himself firmly behind the authority of the nobles. He wants to empower them and give them more authority than they had before under the Reformation. And that means he has to support them in violently exterminating the rebels. So while Martin Luther is angrily denouncing the rebels, we see that the uptick in violence continues. So on April 30th, for example, there are 2 monasteries in Anhausen and Dinkelsbühl, which are plundered and also burned. So these are very expensive properties. They are also properties that would have had a landlord, an abbot in them, who would have been collecting rent from peasants who worked land owned by that monastery, which was also owned by the church. So the taking of movable goods and the burning of those structures is an act of defiance. And it's also quite an expensive amount of damage to be inflicting. Towns across Germany are being approached by organized bands of peasant rebels. They're being asked to sign covenants, whereby they're going to stand with the rebels in their strike and in their demands. They're asked to sell equipment or to supply things like gunpowder or lead or spears. And it's important to recognize that while this is called the Peasants' War, and while we're actually seeing battles against soldiers that look like traditional battles unfolding from April 1525 onwards, there isn't one unified peasant army. There isn't one unified leadership either. There are sort of conglomerations of local bands that are moving around in their local districts. They're exerting pressure on the landlords and the towns near where they live. And then there'll be other bands in other districts doing these things. So the activities are synchronous and they're sympathetic, but they're not centrally coordinated. And that's why you can have a peasant leader like Little Jack Rohrbach, leading a group of rebels near Winesburg, but you'll have other leaders leading other bands of peasants in other areas. And they're not necessarily well coordinated with each other either. They share the same broad goals, but they're regionally organized. Some historians estimate that some 300,000 peasants were involved in this uprising. And at its height, which is sort of the spring and summer of 1525, it covers most of the territory that is now modern Germany. So if you look at that on a map, it is a massive amount of area. And it affected a huge number of landlords and monasteries and regions. Many towns are affected directly or indirectly as they are approached by rebels or they're pressured by the sort of regional noblemen to keep them out of the rebel side. Now, I mentioned that the peasants don't have any cavalry, and that's not entirely true. There's one exception to this. So these different regional bands of peasants, they have different leaders. One of the most interesting figures who shows up here is a man named Florian Geyer. And he's actually a nobleman. He's seen action fighting as a mercenary all over at different times previously. But it seems that when the peasant rebellion starts taking off, he organizes a crew who are known as the Black Company. And this is a rapidly assembled group of men. Some of them are colleagues of his, some of them are mercenaries and men he's fought with before, and a lot of them are some hastily trained peasant rebels, and they form the only heavy cavalry unit that has ever been known to fight on the side of peasants in a revolt. So they're not large, but they do have a number of horse, and they do show up in some of the battles. I say some because the Black Company is just one unit, and there are different groups of peasants who are engaging with different groups of soldiers fielded by the Swabian League across Germany at this time. So Florian Geyer and the Black Company show up in some of these things, and he's significant because not only is he not a peasant, but he's willing to train peasants who are farmers in fighting as cavalry, in riding horses, which, farmers never did. So he's a very significant sympathizer, and he fights on behalf of the rebels. Geyer is also interesting because he's very much a reformer. He's a sympathizer with Martin Luther. There's even a report that he accompanies Martin Luther on a trip to Wittenberg in 1523, which is only a year before the peasant rebellion breaks out. So Geyer is not just sort of distantly sympathetic to reform ideas. He's actually traveled with Luther himself. And Geyer lines himself up firmly with the peasants on this, despite Luther's vituperative condemnation. There's one other known non-peasant ally in the Peasants' War, and his name was Götz von Berlichingen. And he's very interesting because he is also a nobleman, and he's fought as a mercenary, as many of them did, in many previous conflicts. And he had a bone to pick with the Swabian League. He had some quarrels with them. He'd fought sort of against them on behalf of some nobles. He'd fought against nobles who were members of the Swabian League. He thought that he'd been treated unjustly by them. And so when the peasant rebellion breaks out, he actually lines up with the rebels in his district and assumes leadership of their organized band for about a month. And he says later that he did this because he wanted to try to moderate the excesses of the rebels. Whether or not that's true, we don't know. I mean, he also had to negotiate for his life after the fact, so he may have moderated his story. But he's a very colorful figure and is sometimes called Götz of the Iron Hand, because even though it's 1500, he'd lost a hand and part of an arm due to his involvement in previous wars. And so he actually had an iron prosthetic that had two fingers that moved. And so that allowed him to kind of hold the reins of his horse while riding. And so he's this sort of bizarre figure with an iron hand who, for a short time, is leading a group of rebellious peasants. This iron hand of his is still available and can be seen in a museum somewhere. However, for the most part, many of the peasants who are armed and fighting at this stage in the spring of 1525 don't have cavalry and they don't have seasoned mercenaries showing them how to maneuver on the field. And so, with a couple of exceptions where you had a band that did have this sort of an asset, most of them are at an enormous disadvantage. And we can see this in May 15th, 1525, when a group of peasant rebels attack the castle at Würzburg. And they attempt to lay siege to it and to invade and occupy, and they fail, partly because castles are designed specifically to resist attack, and the peasants don't have the manpower or the weaponry that would be required to successfully carry this off. One of the most significant and notorious battles in the Peasants' War also occurred on this same day, but another location. May 15th, 1525, the Battle of Frankenhausen. This battle is very important, not just because of the number of casualties it entailed, but because of the capture of a very significant man. His name was Thomas Müntzer, and he was one of the ideologues of the peasant uprising. He wasn't just a local organizer. He was a man whose ideas were heavily infused into the 12 Articles themselves and who had a huge amount of influence. His name was Thomas Müntzer. And in our last episode, you might recall, Thomas Müntzer was busy penning letters to local nobles in which he describes them as sacks of worms and asks by what authority they keep peasants underfoot and treat them so badly. So he's very much a voice for the rebels in many situations and a very important organizer. So Thomas Müntzer is present on the eve of the Battle of Frankenhausen. He's a preacher, and he has this very apocalyptic vision of what's going on right now. So he sees the peasant rebellion as a sign of the end times. You know, this in Christian theology, this means that the return of Jesus Christ is imminent, and therefore we should expect episodes of violence and large amounts of death and disorder. And so he sees the peasant rebellion as part of this terrible period, which is necessary before the return of Christ. And so he's walking up and down before the battle, and he's praying for the peasant soldiers. He's blessing them. He tells them that they're doing God's work, that God is on their side, and that they're going to be invulnerable to stones and blows and gunshot. Well, while we can't really be in a position to judge the first part of Thomas Müntzer's assertion, he was most certainly wrong about the invulnerability part. Because the following day, when these peasant soldiers went into battle, they faced another highly trained army fielded by the Swabian League. These were landsknecht, which were German mercenaries, famous throughout Europe, extremely well-disciplined, and with loads of experience from very, very recent fighting in other parts of Europe. They were also distinctive visually because they carried large pikes and they had extremely colorful uniforms, as well as sort of curving helmets with a ridge on the top of them. The landsknecht were a force to be reckoned with wherever they went. And unfortunately, our peasant rebels were nowhere close to a match for them. The Battle of Frankenhausen is a moment that some historians think breaks the back of the Peasant War, just at this very moment, May 15th. And the casualties that the peasants suffered range in estimate from between 3,000 to 10,000. By contrast, less than 10 landsknecht casualties, by which we mean dead or wounded, were reported. So the disproportionality of death and wounding in this battle is just simply astonishing to think of. You would think the landsknecht were fighting children with numbers like this. Most of the population of Frankenhausen, thousands of peasants, including those who live in the town of Frankenhausen, are killed, and some 600 peasant rebels are taken prisoner by the Swabian League army, the landsknecht. Among the people taken prisoner at the end of this battle is Thomas Munzer, the preacher and de facto leader of this particular band of rebels. And there's one historical account that actually reports that after Munzer's capture, he was given a very civil interview with a couple of nobles who were in charge of that army, who sat him down and basically said, "Why? Why did you do all this? Why is this rebellion so vicious and widespread?" And Thomas Munzer has a discussion with them, basically like an equal, in which he says, "We did what we did because it was in accordance with the justice of God. And everything we have done has been justified by the principles in Scripture." Now, of course, this moment of civilized conversation didn't last very long, because after hearing what Thomas Munzer had to say, he was then subjected to the usual interrogation, which was under torture. So that was happening in a different room, and Thomas Munzer was tortured, we don't know for how long, but until he said exactly what he was required to say, which is to recant his rebellious tendencies, to recant his Reformation ideas, and to return to the Catholic faith and to obedience. And having extracted these words from him through whatever unspeakable means, we don't know, but it must have been awful, Thomas Munzer was then condemned to be executed the following day. But his recanting was most certainly not sincere, not only because he was tortured, but because he also wrote a letter that same day to some of his supporters in which he said, "Do not let my death be a stumbling block. Do not take the fact that I'm going to die here as a sign that anything you've done is wrong, that my faith remains the same, that my belief in what we have done is the same, and that you should go forward in the certainty that that is right." Thomas Munzer is reported to have said under torture, before they got him to the recanting part of things, that he and the rebels desired a society in which, quote, "all things were held in common." And you can recognize here that he's quoting explicitly from the New Testament and from things that were said in early Christian communities. And whether or not Thomas Munzer said these exact words or not, they're a fair representation of the more radical elements in the peasant rebellion, of those peasants who weren't just looking for a renegotiation of their rent contracts, but were looking for a far more thoroughgoing redesign of society and relationships between farmers and nobles altogether. In a sickening footnote to the defeat at the Battle of Frankenhausen, we have reports that peasant women approached the nobles who had taken captive 600 peasant rebels, and they petitioned these nobles for the lives of their husbands, that they be spared because they had surrendered. And the nobles said, "Okay, we'll give you your husbands back on the condition that you punish these 2 rebel priests that we know are still in the town there, who've been part of your movement." And the peasant women returned to the town, and they found these priests who had been sympathizers and rebels with them, and they beat them to death in the marketplace with cudgels, continuing for a full half hour after the men had died. And we have this from a town councillor who was resident in the town at the time. The rebellion wasn't over, of course, but Frankenhausen had been a staggering loss. On May 21st, peasants burned their lord's castle at Hohenlohe. So now we have the attack and the destruction of a noble fortress. On May 22nd, the Margrave of Casimir, another local noble, decides to set out with a group of soldiers to subdue the rebels in his area. 23 of them are beheaded, 58 of them are blinded, and forbidden to enter the town on his estate ever again. In early June, the Swabian forces kill some 2,000 to 3,000 peasants at Königshofen. In all these battles I've reported, in May, the losses reported by the Swabian League forces are only some 150 men across multiple battlefields, whereas in all of these engagements, peasants have been dying by the thousands. So this raises the question of why were the peasants so incredibly ineffective in these face-offs with the Swabian League forces? There were certainly enormous numbers of them. Why are they dying like children? Firstly, they were untrained. A few of them had served as foot soldiers in various conflicts previously, but the ability to wield a pike or a sword on the front line is quite different from having the knowledge of strategy and tactics required to direct men in a field in such a way that they can face off against another force and effectively surround and defeat them. So the perspective of a foot soldier or infantryman is not the same as the perspective or skill set required of a commander. And while the peasants had some infantrymen, they had almost no seasoned commanders. The Swabian League, by contrast, had all of the above. Secondly, they were ill-equipped. Yes, they had some weapons. They had a few of the primitive firearms in use at the time, but by no means did they have as many or as high quality the number of weapons as those carried by their opponents. And most importantly, they had almost no cavalry, whereas in many of these engagements, they were facing off against an army that had a very effective cavalry unit, and those units would literally ride them down and trample them underfoot. There was very little that a man on the ground with a sword could do, especially if he had little knowledge of trench digging and spear-wielding tactics against an experienced cavalry unit. Thirdly, they were not a single unified force. They didn't have a centralized command system or strategy. Instead, they were primarily a coalition of local bands whose main concern was getting concessions from the town and the noblemen in their region. While they communicated with and supported bands farther afield, they were often very reluctant to walk miles away from their own district and their homes, which would then of course be open to attack, to support some other unit or band of peasants farther afield. And so the inability to coordinate and to reinforce each other physically was also a key factor. By June 6th, emissaries from peasant rebels in the town of Rothenburg approach the Margrave of Casimir, the same one who was busy beheading and blinding peasants in his area, to ask for pardon. They're saying, okay, we're done fighting. Please, let's stop. We are sorry. We will return to obedience. We'll do what you want. We're done. And they similarly send emissaries to the Swabian League, which is that league of nobles, knights, and imperial cities that the Margrave is part of, and which they had initially appealed to mediate their dispute. And the Swabian League sends word back to these rebels at Rothenburg, and they say, you have to offer an unconditional surrender. You cannot demand any terms. You surrender with no conditions, and you have to do whatever you're told. In towns that are retaken by the nobles, where the peasants have been defeated, Mass is reinstated immediately. So what is the Mass? It is the regular Catholic church service that is performed by the local priest. And this is significant because it indicates how closely reform ideas were embedded in the peasant rebellion. The peasants saw themselves as agents of the Reformation, and apparently some nobles shared that view, which is why they thought it was so important to reinstate the authority of the Catholic Church in places where they had been victorious. So here we can see the authority of the Catholic hierarchy being reinstated on the swords of nobles who are also defending their own power structure, and the two go together in many cases. Although not all nobles who are involved in suppressing the peasant rebellion are Catholics, the idea that religion and Reformation ideas can be wielded from the ground up is something that all nobles are determined to destroy, whether they are Catholics or Protestants. By late June, the Margrave of Casimir rides into the town of Rothenburg with 400 horsemen, 1,000 infantry, and 200 wagons of weapons and gear. These soldiers spread out into neighboring towns and villages, who have already surrendered. It's been an unconditional surrender. But now it's time for revenge. They spread out to neighboring peasant villages, burning churches and plundering whatever they can find. Why are they burning churches? Because the churches they're burning are the churches that the peasant rebels had instituted. They were reform churches. They were churches where you had Reformation speakers speaking Reformation Christianity. And so the Margrave is going to burn those churches, and they're going to bring back a return to the way religion was done before. Citizens of the town of Rothenburg were summoned to the town square, and the names of those who were known to be sympathizers or involved in the rebellion are publicly read out. Those people are then beheaded on the spot, and their bodies are left on display in the marketplace as a grisly reminder to others of the penalties for disobedience. In other battles during the bloody summer of 1525, peasants are now routinely slaughtered by the thousands, even after they have surrendered. The nobles, with their highly organized forces, are systematically going through all the districts where there have been rebel groups or rebel episodes, and they're ensuring that nothing remains. Little Jack Rohrbach, for example, the man who had been leading the group of peasants involved in the Winesburg Massacre, which, remember, was an episode that led to the death of less than 30 people, he's hunted down by the nobles, chained to a stick, and he's burned alive. By September of 1525, it's all over. The Peasant War is finished. Every group of rebels in any part of Germany has been effectively crushed. The nobles are victorious, and there are some 100,000 dead peasants. In a bizarre moment of agreement, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, and Martin Luther all publicly praise God for the defeat of the peasants and publicly praise the nobles' victory. The aftermath of this rebellion was sickening in its effects. I'm going to read you a short passage in a book called The Peasants' War in Germany by Ernst Bax, where he says, quote, "The total number of the peasants and their allies who fell, either in fighting or at the hands of the executioners, is estimated by Anselm in his Berner Chronik at 130,000. It was certainly not less than 100,000. For months after, the executioner was active in many of the affected districts. Spalatin says, 'Of hanging and beheading there is no end.' Another writer has it, quote, 'It was all so that even a stone had been moved to pity, for the chastisement and vengeance of the conquering lords was great.'" Unquote. The executions within the jurisdiction of the Swabian League alone are stated at 10,000. Truchsess's provost boasted of having hanged or beheaded 1,200 with his own hand. More than 50,000 fugitives were recorded, and these, according to a Swabian League order, were all outlawed in such wise that anyone who found them might slay them without fear of consequences. The condition of the families of the dead and of the fugitives was appalling. Numbers perished from starvation. The wives and children of the insurgents were in some cases forcibly driven from their homesteads and even from their native territory. In one of the pamphlets published in 1525, after the events of that year, we read, quote, "Houses are burned, fields and vineyards lie fallow, clothes and household goods are robbed or burned, cattle and sheep are taken away, the same as to horses and trappings. The prince, the gentleman, or the nobleman will have his rent and due. Eternal God, whither shall the widows and poor children go forth to seek it," unquote. There were so many peasant men killed in the German uprising that agricultural production would be affected for some 2 generations. And the number of people who perished due to starvation or poverty is probably not even accounted for in the numbers of casualties and deaths we have here, which mostly relate to battlefield deaths and executions. The economic effect was crippling, and it would be several centuries before even one of the peasants' 12 demands would be met. By almost all measures, the Peasant War was a complete failure. Restitution taxes were now levied on peasants by both nobles and monasteries to repair the damages that had been caused, so that in the end, the economic burden that the peasants suffered under was even heavier than it was before. Nobles, both Catholic and Protestant, would now insist on keeping a firm hand on the control of religion in their own territories. For Protestant nobles, it meant ensuring that reform ideas could never again be wielded against them. Henceforth, the business of the Reformation in Germany would be managed by the nobles, and this movement is referred to by historians as the magisterial Reformation, that this Peasants' War was an inflection point that changed the direction of the Reformation itself. And a perfect illustration of that, quite literally, is a figure called Karsthans. Now, Karsthans translates from German basically as hands of the hoe. Okay, so he's a personality that's invented by pro-Reformation pamphleteers. So Hands of the Hoe appears in multiple pamphlets authored by different pro-Reformation authors prior to the Peasants' War. And he's this German peasant who has absorbed Martin Luther's ideas, and because of the wisdom of the scripture, is wiser than all of his social superiors. So he's wiser than the nobles and the scholars and the bishops, and he gives voice to Reformation ideas. He's the everyday man. And his wisdom comes directly from the gospel. He's empowered to speak because he has the truth. Well, after 1525, Karsthans vanishes from Reformation pamphlets. And it's important to note that peasants were not writing these pamphlets. The fictional character of Karsthans was not invented by a reform-minded peasant, as far as we know. He was probably the work of middle-class pro-Reformation writers who were busy writing these, short texts or pamphlets in support of Martin Luther's ideas. And the figure of Karsthans represents the common man that these pro-Reformation thinkers saw as someone who was going to be liberated by these ideas and someone who was wiser than his social superiors because he had the gospel. After 1525, Karsthans vanishes. He no longer appears in pro-Reformation pamphleteering because people had had an all too real experience with the liberated Reformation peasant, and no one wanted any more of that. There is a monument to the Peasant War in the town of Bad Frankenhausen in what was formerly East Germany. And it commemorates the revolt as a workers' rebellion, which, of course, it was. One of the first major historical studies of the Peasants' War was done by none other than Friedrich Engels, who was a close collaborator of Karl Marx and laid the intellectual foundations for communism. And he, too, was fascinated by this as an example of class conflict, of workers organizing together, striking, and rising up against their overlords. Engels' interest in this episode is unsurprising, but his colleague Karl Marx famously described religion as the opiate of the masses. But I would argue that in the Peasants' War, religion was the methamphetamine of the masses. It was, in fact, the thing that galvanized them into action and made them crazy enough to think that they could win. While some, like Engels, will analyze the Peasants' War through the lens of economics and social inequality, it also raises some key questions theologically. It's impossible to avoid the controversy about what is the message of Christianity. Because the peasants clearly had one idea about it, and Martin Luther and the nobles had another. And both of them quoted scripture. Were the peasants so wrong to claim that there was something wrong with being owned like property if we were all equal in the sight of God? I mean, if God thought that we all had equal value and were equally worthy of redemption, why was it that in everyday life, some people had no rights at all? How could these two things be consistent? How could you believe the one thing religiously and also support a society in which some humans manifestly have far more value and others have none at all? The peasant rebels made frequent use of Bible verses in their written 12 demands to justify what they were asking for. They saw their rebellion as in alignment with the principles of the Bible and Christianity itself. But the meaning of a religious message is very much conditioned by the ears that hear it. And the nobles would have recourse to quoting verses of the Bible as well, and they did. For example, they could quote Romans 13, verses 1 to 6, which require obedience to rulers and the state, and say that no one is a ruler unless God allows it. Quote, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant, for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience." So you can see that these verses in Romans lend themselves very well to the assertion of things like the divine right of kings, which we'll see James I asserting only a few years later, where he says, "I am king because it's God's will, and therefore if you resist me or anything that I do, you're also resisting the will of God." Taking a verse like this and just pulling it out of the text can lead to an idea that justifies the fusion of church and state, and that says that there is no space between your government authority and the will of God. And these are exactly the verses that were quoted by Martin Luther against the rebels, and they were quoted by the nobles themselves. We are the servants of God. We have our noble position because God wills it so, and you are a peasant because that's also what God wills. You are my servant because that is the divine order that God has ordained. But Christians have argued over the centuries, and not just in the Peasants' War, but many situations after that these verses in Romans do not justify blind obedience to anything that a government, a king, or a head of state might demand. That is definitely not how all Christians have interpreted these verses. And the peasants were not alone in arguing that that's not what these verses mean. The peasants, for example, could point to other verses, such as Galatians 3, verse 28, which says, "There is neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for we're all one in Christ Jesus." So they would use verses like this to say arbitrary distinctions of status and rights are just that. They're arbitrary. They don't have any moral foundation because in Christ we're all one. We're all equal. Very similar debates with the same verses surfaced centuries later in America as Christians argued about whether or not the Bible justified slavery. And those who were slave owners in the U.S. at the time were fond of pointing to the words of Paul in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 to 7, where it says, quote, "Servants, be obedient to those that are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord, not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. So again, here's a verse which suggests that if you're a servant or if you're a slave, you owe obedience to the person who is placed in authority over you as if it was to Christ. But abolitionists, who argued against slavery, stated that the larger meaning of the Bible, the overarching framework, the message of Jesus, was one of love and one of equality and one that was inconsistent with owning human beings as property, that there was no part of that that was consistent with being a Christian. But you see that both of these groups were quoting scripture in support of their position. And so in this, we have to admit that there was something Martin Luther was quite wrong about. You see, Martin Luther famously claimed that a person opening the Bible and reading it could just understand what the will of God was. It would be very clear. The message of Scripture is clear, he said. It's right there on the page. And yet, we have very serious Christians pointing to the very same pages and coming to radically different conclusions about what they mean. This, too, is part of the legacy of the Protestant Reformation. It's the multiplicity of interpretations of the Bible. It's the idea that everyone can read the text and understand what it means that has led to different groups of people understanding it very differently. And that explains a lot about the different denominations and the multiplying groups of Christians who broadly identify as Protestant, which is also the legacy of Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, and this moment in history. The Peasant War was the largest popular uprising that had ever been seen prior to the French Revolution. It was a cry for fairness and equality and things that we now call human rights. The rebels wanted basic freedoms that you and I take for granted. And in this, they were sadly far ahead of their times. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. You can catch Villains and Virgins podcast wherever you listen to audio, whether that's Spotify or Apple or Overcast or whatever platform you use. And you can also get an illustrated version every time on my YouTube channel. For more information about the sources or the making of this episode, or just to support the making of more episodes like this, please check out my Patreon link, which appears in the episode description. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series, and I hope to see you in the next episode.